expanding on each actor's career context, preparation methods, specific scene breakdowns, critical reception, cultural impact, and comparisons to prior Bond casts fills the narrative richly. Craig's physical evolution, Dench's emotional farewell, Bardem's eccentric villainy, and supporting turns collectively created a landmark cinematic achievement. The casting choices not only served the story's needs but resonated with audiences worldwide, contributing to Skyfall's status as a high point in the James Bond saga. Skyfall 2012 production, release and reception, production, development and pre-production work on what was internally referred to as Bond 23 began in 2009, but the project ground to a halt for most of 2010 because of the severe financial difficulties facing Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the Hollywood studio that had co-owned the James Bond franchise for decades. MGM's troubles were serious enough that the company was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, and with the studio's future uncertain, every other piece of the production simply stopped moving. Financing could not be arranged, contracts could not be finalized, and the creative team was left waiting to see whether the studio would survive in a form that could still make films at all. It was only once MGM emerged from bankruptcy on the 21st December 2010 that pre-production was able to resume in earnest. The renewed momentum showed up almost immediately. In January 2011, barely a month after MGM's exit from bankruptcy proceedings, the studio and the Broccoli family, who control Bond's producing entity Eon Productions, jointly announced that the 23rd Bond film would open on the 9th of November 2012, with principal photography targeted to begin in the latter part of 2011. Not long afterward, MGM and its new distribution partner Sony Pictures revised the release plan again, deciding to move the United Kingdom premiere date up so that British audiences would see the film 2 weeks before audiences in the United States. While the American date of the 9th November remained fixed, the budget assigned to the production has been reported at figures ranging from around $150 million up to $200 million, putting it in a similar range to its predecessor, Quantum of Solace, which had also cost roughly 200 million because 2012 marked 50 years since the release of the very first Bond film, Dr. No. The studio built an entire year of festivities around the anniversary, and Skyfall was conceived and marketed as the centerpiece of those celebrations. The seeds of the story actually went back further than the bankruptcy crisis. After Quantum of Solace came out in 2008, producer Barbara Broccoli suggested publicly that the still untitled next installment might continue to explore the shadowy quantum organization that had been introduced in Casino Royale and carried through the following film. That idea, however, would eventually be abandoned as the project evolved through several very different drafts and treatments. Rumors about the film's content and title circulated widely while the screenplay was still being hammered out. In August 2011, the Serbian newspaper Blick reported that the new Bond film would be called Carte Blanche and would adapt the recent continuation novel of the same name written by Jeffrey Deaver. Eon Productions moved quickly to shut the story down, issuing an official denial on the 30th August that flatly rejected any connection between the forthcoming picture and the Deaver novel. A few weeks later, on the 3 October 2011, internet sleuths noticed that 15 domain names, among them JamesBondSkyfall.com and SkyfallSayFilm.com, had been quietly registered on behalf of MGM and Sony by the brand protection firm Mark Monitor, effectively giving away the real title before it was formally announced. The producers made it official at a press conference on the 3rd of November 2011, with Barbara Broccoli explaining that the chosen title carried an emotional resonance that would only become clear once audiences had seen the finished film. As it turned out, Skyfall is the name of the crumbling family estate in the Scottish Highlands where Bond grew up, and it becomes the setting of the film's climactic confrontation. That same 3 November press conference, held at the Corinthia Hotel in London, doubled as the occasion on which the principal cast was unveiled, a detail made especially poignant by the fact that it fell exactly 50 years after Sean Connery had first been introduced to the press as the screen's James Bond ahead of Dr. No. Daniel Craig stepped into the role of 007 for a third consecutive time, and he later said he considered himself fortunate to have been given the opportunity to keep playing the character. Sam Mendes, describing how he saw Bond's psychological state at this point in the story, characterized him as a man weighed down by a mixture of weariness, boredom, depression, and a creeping doubt about the career path he had chosen for himself. Judi Dench came back as M for what would prove to be her seventh and final appearance in the role, a fixture of the rebooted series since Casino Royale, and before that, the Pierce Brosnan era. Casting the film's antagonist generated a great deal of attention. Javier Bardem was brought on board to play Raul Silva, a cyber terrorist whose campaign of vengeance is aimed squarely at the people he blames for betraying him. Bardem later described his character as something more layered than a conventional villain, while Craig spoke of the unusually charged, almost personal dynamic that exists between Bond and Silva within the story. Mendes admitted he had pushed hard to get Bardem for the part, believing the actor had the potential to create one of the more indelible antagonists in the franchise's long history. Mendes wanted Silva to embody a quality he felt had been missing from Bond pictures for quite a while, and he judged that Bardem possessed the rare capacity to disappear into a character so completely that the villain would feel like more than simply a mechanism for driving the plot forward. As part of his preparation, Bardem had the entire screenplay translated into Spanish, his native language, a level of dedication that Mendes pointed to as evidence of just how seriously the actor was taking the role for Silva's look. Bardem dyed his hair a shade of blonde after working through visual ideas together with Mendes, a choice that afterward prompted some commentators to note a passing resemblance between the character and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Berenice Marlohe was cast as Severine, a woman who had once been rescued, in a deeply complicated sense of the word, from Macau's sex trade by Silva, and who now works as his associate. Marlowe called her character glamorous and enigmatic, and said she drew inspiration for the part from Xenia Onatopp, the memorable henchwoman villain played by Famke Janssen in GoldenEye. Ralph Fiennes joined the ensemble as Gareth Mallory, a former lieutenant colonel in the British Army, who within the story chairs the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee responsible for overseeing MI6. By the film's end, Mallory ascends to become the new M. During filming, Fiennes was cagey about revealing details of the part, saying only that it was an interesting role that he was having a lot of fun with. It was not the character's first brush with the franchise. Either Fiennes had actually been in contention to play Bond himself many years earlier during the casting process for GoldenEye. Naomie Harris returned to the series as a character eventually revealed to be Miss Moneypenny, though the production kept that connection deliberately murky for much of the promotional run-up. She was initially introduced to the public simply as Eve, an MI6 field agent working alongside Bond, and even a speculation mounted in the press that Eve and Moneypenny were one and the same. Nobody officially connected with the film would confirm it. Harris herself pushed back against the theory when asked directly. In her own description of the character, Eve believes herself to be Bond's professional equal, when in truth she remains his junior in experience and standing. Ben Whishaw also came back into the fold, taking on the role of Q, MI6's new and considerably younger quartermaster. Mendes had initially kept quiet about which part Whishaw would be playing, and later revealed that bringing back Moneypenny and Q, alongside introducing a flamboyant new villain, had been his own idea from early on. Rounding out the principal cast, Mendes gave the role of Kincaid, the weathered gamekeeper of the Skyfall estate, to Albert Finney. There had briefly been talk within the production of approaching Sean Connery for a cameo as a nod to the franchise's 50th anniversary, but the idea was set aside out of concern that it would come across as a distracting stunt rather than serving the story. Skyfall turned out to be Finney's last film role before his death in 2019. Mendes' own involvement with the project stretched back even further than most of the cast is. He had first agreed in principle to direct not long after Quantum of Solace was released, and he stayed on in an advisory capacity all through the uncertainty caused by MGM's near collapse. According to accounts of how he ended up attached to the film, it had actually been Craig's idea in the first place that Mendes should take the reins, the two having previously worked together on Road to Perdition. Mendes had also been struck by Craig's stage performance in A Steady Rain on Broadway in 2009. The offer itself came about in a rather unplanned fashion at a Christmas party thrown by Hugh Jackman, where a well-lubricated Craig ran into Mendes and impulsively asked him to direct. The next morning, Craig reportedly had to confess to Barbara Broccoli that he might have just offered the director's chair to Sam Mendes without actually clearing it with anyone first. Mendes, for his part, was initially reluctant since the project did not immediately appeal to him, but he did not turn the offer down outright because of how invested and enthusiastic Craig clearly was. Mendes later said that Craig's casting and performance in Casino Royale represented exactly the kind of shift the Bond franchise had needed. He ultimately committed to the film after sitting down with producers Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli and getting a sense of the creative direction the project was heading in. Speculation swirled in the press that Mendes had ordered rewrites intended to strip out action sequences in favor of character-driven material, purportedly with an eye toward awards recognition. Mendes denied that characterization, insisting that the action set pieces remained a central part of the film he wanted to make. Behind the camera, cinematographer Roger Deakins signed on, continuing a collaboration with Mendes that stretched back to Jarhead and Revolutionary Road. Production designer Dennis Gassner returned from earlier entries in the series. Costume designer Jenny Temme came aboard. Alexander Witt directed the second unit. Gary Powell coordinated stunts. Chris Corbould oversaw special effects. And Steve Begg supervised visual effects, all of them Bond veterans by that point. Daniel Kleinman, who had designed main title sequences for earlier films in the series, returned to create Skyfall's opening titles, having stepped back for Quantum of Solace so that the graphic design studio MK12 could handle that film sequence instead. Craig's commitment to the role involved intense physical preparation for Skyfall. He trained rigorously to perform many of his own stunts. including the dramatic opening sequence in Istanbul involving a motorcycle chase and a fall from a moving train. This physicality contrasted with the vulnerability shown in scenes where Bond fails his fitness tests after being presumed dead, highlighting a more human agent grappling with mortality. Director Sam Mendes described Bond in this film as experiencing a combination of lassitude, boredom, depression, and difficulty with what he's chosen to do for a living. A characterization Craig captured with nuanced subtlety through weary glances, quiet introspection, and bursts of raw intensity. The actor's chemistry with the ensemble elevated the film. His interactions with Judi Dench's M carried deep emotional weight, portraying a surrogate mother, son dynamic strained by betrayal and duty. In the climax at Skyfall Lodge, Craig's Bond orchestrates defenses with quiet determination, blending action hero prowess with poignant reflection on his past. Critics praised this depth, noting how Craig's Bond felt more layered than in previous entries, blending the cold efficiency of a killer with moments of genuine warmth and regret. Craig's influence extended beyond performance. He reportedly advocated for Mendes as director after their collaboration on Road to Perdition, and his enthusiasm helped secure key cast members. His approach emphasized realism, eschewing gadgets for psychological depth and practical effects, which aligned perfectly with Skyfall's anniversary celebrating tone. This performance not only helped the film gross over $1 billion, but also earned Craig acclaim for revitalizing the franchise at a time when its relevance was questioned. His Bond in Skyfall is often cited as one of the series' strongest balancing spectacle with character study. Throughout production, Craig navigated the pressures of a high-stakes blockbuster while maintaining authenticity. Interviews revealed his appreciation for the script's focus on Bond's origins and relationships, allowing him to explore facets like isolation and resilience. His physical transformation, maintaining a lean, athletic build while conveying exhaustion, added visual credibility to the narrative of a spy past his prime yet unbreakable in spirit. This multifaceted performance anchored the film's exploration of legacy, making Skyfall a character-driven triumph amid explosive set pieces. Judi Dench as M. Judi Dench's seventh and final appearance as M in Skyfall delivered one of the film's most powerful arcs, transforming the MI6 chief from a stern authority figure into a vulnerable yet defiant leader confronting her past mistakes. Dench had played M since GoldenEye 1995, bringing gravitas and intelligence that redefined the role for a new generation. In Skyfall, her performance reached new emotional heights as M faces a public inquiry, a cyber attack on her agency, and a personal vendetta from former agent Raul Silva. Dench's casting was never in doubt. Her stature as a theatrical powerhouse lent M unparalleled weight. The script gave her expanded screen time, allowing exploration of M's moral ambiguities, particularly her decision years earlier to disavow Silva during the Hong Kong handover, leading to his capture and disfigurement. Dench conveyed this history through subtle expressions of regret mixed with unyielding resolve, especially in the tense underground headquarters scenes and the Scottish finale. Her final moments dying in Bond's arms after a chapel confrontation provided a heartbreaking capstone to her tenure, blending quiet dignity with profound loss. Production anecdotes highlight Dench's professionalism and warmth on set. She shared scenes seamlessly with Craig, their rapport reflecting years of collaboration. Mendes praised her ability to humanize M without sacrificing authority, noting how Dench's eyes conveyed volumes in close-ups during Silva's taunting video messages or the parliamentary hearing. Her performance earned widespread acclaim, contributing to the film's Oscar buzz and solidifying M as one of cinema's iconic spy masters. Dench's M in Skyfall also bridged the old and new MI6. Her clashes with Ralph Fiennes' Gareth Mallory underscored generational shifts in intelligence work, from Cold War era pragmatism to modern oversight. Dench infused these exchanges with sharp wit and underlying tension, making M's arc a meditation on leadership, sacrifice, and obsolescence. Off screen, her commitment inspired the cast. At an advanced age, she endured demanding schedules and location shoots, embodying the resilience her character demanded. This role not only kept her Bond legacy but influenced subsequent portrayals, with her influence lingering in the franchise's emotional core. Javier Bardem as Raul Silva. Javier Bardem's casting as Raul Silva introduced a flamboyant, psychologically complex villain who stood out as one of the Bond series' most memorable antagonists. The Oscar winning Spanish actor, known for intense roles in No Country for Old Men and Vicky Cristina Barcelona, brought theatrical menace and charisma to Silva, a cyber terrorist and ex-MI6 agent seeking revenge against. Bardem initially turned down Bond offers but was persuaded after personal outreach from Daniel Craig at a Los Angeles event. Mendes lobbied aggressively for Bardem, viewing him as essential to creating a villain with depth beyond plot function, one who could be colorless yet unforgettable. Bardem dove into preparation by having the script translated into Spanish, demonstrating commitment. His visual transformation was striking: bleached blonde hair, styled to evoke a hacker aesthetic, prompting Julian Assange comparisons, combined with eccentric mannerisms and a disfigured jaw from a past suicide attempt. This look amplified Silva's unpredictability, blending effete charm with chilling cruelty. Bardem's performance shone in key sequences: the island lair interrogation, where he caresses Bond's chest and shares a homoerotic tinged monologue, the London Underground chase, and the chapel climax. He describes Silva as more than a villain, infusing him with trauma, wit, and theatricality, evident in his playful yet sinister demeanor while blowing up MI6 or executing Severin. Craig noted the very important relationship between Bond and Silva, which Bardem realized through charged tension and mirrored intellect. The actor's approach emphasized psychological realism. Interviews revealed his focus on Silva's backstory of betrayal, torture, and cyanide-induced disfigurement, which he portrayed with grotesque physicality and emotional volatility. Bardem's accent and delivery added exotic flair, distinguishing him from previous Bond foes. His work earned award nominations and praise for revitalizing the villain archetype with campy menace and genuine menace, making Silva a standout in a franchise known for iconic bad guys. On set, his energy elevated ensemble scenes, particularly with Dench, where personal history fueled explosive confrontations. Bardem's contribution helped Skyfall balance spectacle with substance. His Silva wasn't a cartoonish threat but a damaged mirror to Bond and M, exploring themes of abandonment and institutional failure. This depth, achieved through meticulous preparation and fearless choices, cemented Bardem's status as a transformative casting coup. Ralph Fiennes as Gareth Mallory. Ralph Fiennes joined the cast as Gareth Mallory, the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee and eventual new M, bringing authoritative presence and subtle complexity. Fiennes, with a career spanning Shakespearean roles and blockbusters like The English Patient, was a natural fit for the bureaucratic yet battle-hardened figure. He had been considered for Bond in GoldenEye, adding ironic resonance to his role overseeing 007. Mallory starts as a political antagonist pressuring Dench's M to retire, but evolves into an ally and successor. Finis conveyed this arc through measured intensity, stern in inquiries, supportive in crises. His military background, former SAS lieutenant colonel, informed physical scenes like the underground escape, where he aids the team with calm competence. By the film's end, his appointment as M symbolizes renewal, with Fiennes hinting at future stewardship. Fiennes described the part as really interesting and quite fun during production, enjoying the blend of desk-bound authority and field action. His chemistry with Craig and Dench grounded the MI6 politics, providing contrast to more flamboyant elements. Mendes used Fiennes' gravitas to explore themes of oversight versus operational freedom, making Mallory a bridge between traditional espionage and contemporary realities. Naomie Harris as Eve Moneypenny. Naomie Harris portrayed Eve, later revealed as Miss Moneypenny, reintroducing the iconic character after a hiatus with fresh energy and agency. Initially presented as a field agent, Harris's Eve works closely with Bond in Istanbul and beyond, showcasing competence and chemistry. The reveal in the finale, where she chooses a desk role as Moneypenny under the new M, added emotional payoff. Harris dismissed early speculation about her role, emphasizing Eve's belief in equality with Bond while being his junior. Her performance mixed action prowess the train sequence shoot with warmth and wit in later interactions. This casting modernized Moneypenny, making her an active participant rather than mere secretary, aligning with the film's progressive tones. Berenice Marlohe as Severin. Berenice Marlohe brought glamour and tragedy to Severin, Silva's enigmatic associate and former sex slave. Her casting added international allure, with Marlohe drawing inspiration from GoldenEye's Xenia Onatopp for a seductive yet doomed figure. Limited screen time belied her impact in Macau casino and island scenes, where vulnerability beneath allure shone through. Ben Whishaw as Q. Ben Whishaw's reintroduction of Q as a young tech-savvy quartermaster injected youthful brilliance and dry humor. Mendes championed the return, and Whishaw delivered a cerebral contrast to Bond's physicality, with memorable exchanges about gadgets and hacking. His role in deciphering Silva's laptop advanced the plot while establishing future dynamics. Albert Finney as Kincaid. Albert Finney's Kincaid, the Skyfall gamekeeper, provided grounded Scottish warmth and wisdom as Bond's childhood caretaker figure. Finney anchored the finale with stoic reliability and folksy charm. This was his final film role, adding poignant legacy weight. Producers considered Sean and Connery, but opted against stunt casting, making Finney's authentic performance ideal. Supporting cast and ensemble depth. The full credits reveal a rich tapestry of supporting players enhancing authenticity. Rory Kinnear as Bill Tanner offered loyal MI6 support, with quiet competence in crisis scenes. Minor roles like Shanghai assassins, Macau gamblers, and London officials populated the world with realism. Stunt performers and uncredited actors in action sequences amplified scale, while cameos and background work contributed to immersive global settings from Istanbul to Scotland. Casting extended to practical considerations, location-specific extras for cultural accuracy in Turkey, China, and Scotland. The ensemble's diversity reflected the film's international scope, with performances big and small reinforcing themes of loyalty, betrayal, and resilience. Casting process and production insights. The main cast announcement at the Corinthia Hotel on November 3, 2011 celebrated the 50th Bond anniversary. Producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson prioritized chemistry and star power to honor the milestone. Mendes' vision favored actors capable of depth amid spectacle, leading to targeted pursuits like Bardem and Wishaw. Challenges included scheduling conflicts and the need for physical readiness. Rehearsals focused on building relationships, particularly Bond-M dynamics. Behind the scenes footage and interviews underscore collaborative spirit. Craig and Bardem bonding over intense scenes, Dench mentoring younger actors. This process yielded a cohesive ensemble that propelled Skyfall to critical and commercial success, proving thoughtful casting's power in elevating a franchise entry. Expanding on each actor's career context, preparation methods, specific scene breakdowns, critical reception, cultural impact, and comparisons to prior Bond casts fills the narrative richly. Craig's physical evolution, Dench's emotional farewell, Bardem's eccentric villainy, and supporting turns collectively created a landmark cinematic achievement. The casting choices not only served the story's needs but resonated with audiences worldwide, contributing to Skyfall's status as a high point in the James Bond saga. Skyfall 2012 production, release and reception, production, development and pre-production work on what was internally referred to as Bond 23 began in 2009, but the project ground to a halt for most of 2010 because of the severe financial difficulties facing Metro Goldwyn Mayer, the Hollywood studio that had co-owned the James Bond franchise for decades. MGM's troubles were serious enough that the company was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, and with the studio's future uncertain, every other piece of the production simply stopped moving. Financing could not be arranged, contracts could not be finalized, and the creative team was left waiting to see whether the studio would survive in a form that could still make films at all. It was only once MGM emerged from bankruptcy on the 21st December 2010 that pre-production was able to resume in earnest. The renewed momentum showed up almost immediately. In January 2011, barely a month after MGM's exit from bankruptcy proceedings, the studio and the Broccoli family, who control Bond's producing entity Eon Productions, jointly announced that the 23rd Bond film would open on the 9th of November 2012, with principal photography targeted to begin in the latter part of 2011. Not long afterward, MGM and its new distribution partner Sony Pictures revised the release plan again, deciding to move the United Kingdom premiere date up so that British audiences would see the film 2 weeks before audiences in the United States. While the American date of the 9th November remained fixed, the budget assigned to the production has been reported at figures ranging from around $150 million up to $200 million, putting it in a similar range to its predecessor, Quantum of Solace, which had also cost roughly $200 million because 2012 marked 50 years since the release of the very first Bond film, Dr. No. The studio built an entire year of festivities around the anniversary, and Skyfall was conceived and marketed as the centerpiece of those celebrations. The seeds of the story actually went back further than the bankruptcy crisis. After Quantum of Solace came out in 2008, producer Barbara Broccoli suggested publicly that the still untitled next installment might continue to explore the shadowy quantum organization that had been introduced in Casino Royale and carried through the following film. That idea, however, would eventually be abandoned as the project evolved through several very different drafts and treatments. Rumors about the film's content and title circulated widely while the screenplay was still being hammered out. In August 2011, The Serbian newspaper Blick reported that the new Bond film would be called Carte Blanche and would adapt the recent continuation novel of the same name written by Jeffrey Deaver. Eon Productions moved quickly to shut the story down, issuing an official denial on the 30 August that flatly rejected any connection between the forthcoming picture and the Deaver novel. A few weeks later, on the 3 October 2011, internet sleuths noticed that 15 domain names, among them James Bond Skyfall.com and SkyfallSayFilm.com, had been quietly registered on behalf of MGM and Sony by the brand protection firm Mark Monitor, effectively giving away the real title before it was formally announced. The producers made it official at a press conference on the 3rd November 2011 with Barbara Broccoli explaining that the chosen title carried an emotional resonance that would only become clear once audiences had seen the finished film. As it turned out, Skyfall is the name of the crumbling family estate in the Scottish Highlands where Bond grew up, and it becomes the setting of the film's climactic confrontation. That same 3 November press conference, held at the Corinthia Hotel in London, doubled as the occasion on which the principal cast was unveiled, a detail made especially poignant by the fact that it fell exactly 50 years after Sean Connery had first been introduced to the press as the screen's James Bond ahead of Dr. No. Daniel Craig stepped into the role of 007 for a third consecutive time, and he later said he considered himself fortunate to have been given the opportunity to keep playing the character. Sam Mendes, describing how he saw Bond's psychological state at this point in the story, characterized him as a man weighed down by a mixture of weariness, boredom, depression, and a creeping doubt about the career path he had chosen for himself. Judi Dench came back as M for what would prove to be her seventh and final appearance in the role, a fixture of the rebooted series since Casino Royale, and before that, the Pierce Brosnan era. Casting the film's antagonist generated a great deal of attention. Javier Bardem was brought on board to play Raul Silva, a cyber terrorist whose campaign of vengeance is aimed squarely at the people he blames for betraying him. Bardem later described his character as something more layered than a conventional villain, while Craig spoke of the unusually charged, almost personal dynamic that exists between Bond and Silva within the story. Mendes admitted he had pushed hard to get Bardem for the part, believing the actor had the potential to create one of the more indelible antagonists in the franchise's long history. Mendes wanted Silva to embody a quality he felt had been missing from Bond pictures for quite a while, and he judged that Bardem possessed the rare capacity to disappear into a character so completely that the villain would feel like more than simply a mechanism for driving the plot forward. As part of his preparation, Bardem had the entire screenplay translated into Spanish, his native language, a level of dedication that Mendes pointed to as evidence of just how seriously the actor was taking the role for Silva's look. Bardem dyed his hair a shade of blonde after working through visual ideas together with Mendes, a choice that afterward prompted some commentators to note a passing resemblance between the character and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Berenice Marlohe was cast as Severine, a woman who had once been rescued, in a deeply complicated sense of the word, from Macau's sex trade by Silva, and who now works as his associate. Marlowe called her character glamorous and enigmatic and said she drew inspiration for the part from Xenia Onatopp, the memorable henchwoman villain played by Famke Janssen in Golden Eye. Ralph Fiennes joined the ensemble as Gareth Mallory, a former lieutenant colonel in the British Army, who within the story chairs the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee responsible for overseeing MI6. By the film's end, Mallory ascends to become the new M. During filming, Fiennes was cagey about revealing details of the part, saying only that it was an interesting role that he was having a lot of fun with. It was not the character's first brush with the franchise. Either Fiennes had actually been in contention to play Bond himself many years earlier during the casting process for GoldenEye. Naomie Harris returned to the series as a character eventually revealed to be Miss Moneypenny, though the production kept that connection deliberately murky for much of the promotional run-up. She was initially introduced to the public simply as Eve, an MI6 field agent working alongside Bond, and even as speculation mounted in the press that Eve and Moneypenny were one and the same, nobody officially connected with the film would confirm it. Harris herself pushed back against the theory when asked directly. In her own description of the character, Eve believes herself to be Bond's professional equal, when in truth she remains his junior in experience and standing. Ben Whishaw also came back into the fold, taking on the role of Q, MI6's new and considerably younger quartermaster. Mendes had initially kept quiet about which part Whishaw would be playing, and later revealed that bringing back Moneypenny and Q alongside introducing a flamboyant new villain had been his own idea from early on. Rounding out the principal cast, Mendes gave the role of Kincaid, the weathered gamekeeper of the Skyfall estate, to Albert Finney. There had briefly been talk within the production of approaching Sean Connery for a cameo as a nod to the franchise's 50th anniversary, but the idea was set aside out of concern that it would come across as a distracting stunt rather than serving the story. Skyfall turned out to be Finney's last film role before his death in 2019. Mendes' own involvement with the project stretched back even further than most of the cast is. He had first agreed in principle to direct not long after Quantum of Solace was released, and he stayed on in an advisory capacity all through the uncertainty caused by MGM's near collapse. According to accounts of how he ended up attached to the film, it had actually been Craig's idea in the first place that Mendes should take the reins, the two having previously worked together on Road to Perdition. Mendes had also been struck by Craig's stage performance in A Steady Rain on Broadway in 2009. The offer itself came about in a rather unplanned fashion at a Christmas party thrown by Hugh Jackman, where a well-lubricated Craig ran into Mendes and impulsively asked him to direct. The next morning, Craig reportedly had to confess to Barbara Broccoli that he might have just offered the director's chair to Sam Mendes without actually clearing it with anyone first. Mendes, for his part, was initially reluctant since the project did not immediately appeal to him, but he did not turn the offer down outright because of how invested and enthusiastic Craig clearly was. Mendes later said that Craig's casting and performance in Casino Royale represented exactly the kind of shift the Bond franchise had needed. He ultimately committed to the film after sitting down with producers Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli and getting a sense of the creative direction the project was heading in. Speculation swirled in the press that Mendes had ordered rewrites intended to strip out action sequences in favor of character-driven material, purportedly with an eye toward awards recognition. Mendes denied that characterization, insisting that the action set pieces remained a central part of the film he wanted to make. Behind the camera, cinematographer Roger Deakins signed on, continuing a collaboration with Mendes that stretched back to Jarhead and Revolutionary Road. Production designer Dennis Gassner returned from earlier entries in the series. Costume designer Jenny Temme came aboard. Alexander Witt directed the second unit. Gary Powell coordinated stunts. Chris Corbould oversaw special effects. And Steve Begg supervised visual effects, all of them Bond veterans by that point. Daniel Kleinman, who had designed main title sequences for earlier films in the series, returned to create Skyfall's opening titles, having stepped back for Quantum of Solace so that the graphic design studio MK12 could handle that film sequence instead. The screenplay itself went through an unusually turbulent development process. Peter Morgan had originally been commissioned to write it, but he departed the project once MGM's bankruptcy filing brought everything to a standstill. Morgan later claimed that the version of the script that eventually reached the screen still carried what he called the big hook of his original concept. But Mendes rejected that characterization outright, maintaining that Morgan's approach had been discarded entirely once Mendes signed on to direct. Screenwriter Robert Wade offered his own explanation for the mismatch, noting that he and his writing partner Neil Purvis were steeped in the world of Ian Fleming's novels, whereas Morgan's sensibilities leaned more toward the espionage fiction of John le Carré, a difference in instinct that simply did not mesh. Morgan had co-written an earlier treatment with Purvis and Wade called Once Upon a Spy, a version of the story in which M is blackmailed by a Russian oligarch, a former KGB officer with whom she had once had an affair while stationed in Cold War era West Berlin, and which was ultimately meant to culminate with Bond being forced to kill M himself. Mendes disliked most of that treatment, but wanted to preserve its ending involving M's death. From there, Purvis and Wade produced a new script that borrowed structural ideas from two of Fleming's own novels, You Only Live Twice and The Man with the Golden Gun, imagining a story in which Bond is presumed dead following an accident and eventually makes his way back to a London and an MI6 he barely recognizes. An earlier iteration of this screenplay had hewed even closer to the literary source material, giving Bond a bout of amnesia and having him unknowingly father a child with a lover in Turkey, who would later track him down after his return to MI6. That version would also have sent Bond chasing a villain modeled on Fleming's Francisco Scaramanga into the Andes Mountains. Aiming for a tone the writers likened to Heart of Darkness, development of this draft slowed as MGM's finances worsened. By the end of 2010, Purvis and Wade had finished a version titled Nothing is Forever, in which a villain named Raul Souza kills M with a bomb aboard the Barcelona metro, leaving a bureaucratic figure called Malander to take over as the new M. Still unsatisfied with how the third act played out, the writers went back and revised it into the ending eventually set in Scotland. From there, playwright and screenwriter John Logan took over the rewrite, retaining most of the basic story structure that Purvis and Wade had built, while giving the dialogue and character work its final shape. Logan, a longtime friend of Mendes's who had been brought onto the project by him personally, described their working relationship as highly collaborative and later called the experience of writing Skyfall one of the most rewarding of his screenwriting career. British playwright Jez Butterworth also contributed to the script without receiving formal credit. Molocation scouting got underway well before a final script had even been locked. In April 2011, Mendes and Broccoli traveled to South Africa to scout potential settings. Around the same time that the production moved into its more formal pre-production phase in August 2011, Reports surfaced suggesting that a significant portion of shooting would take place in India, with specific scenes said to be planned for the Sarojini Nagar district of New Delhi and for railway lines running between Goa and Ahmedabad. Securing permission to close sections of the Konkan Railway for filming proved complicated, mirroring similar permit headaches that had affected the production crews of The Dark Knight Rises and Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol around the same period. Permission was eventually granted, but by then the production had moved on and the film ultimately was not shot in India at all. The India episode was, in many ways, characteristic of the broader logistical challenges that face a production of this scale as it moves through the location scouting and permitting process. Large international productions frequently identify a location that seems ideal creatively, only to discover that securing the necessary permissions from local authorities, railway operators, or municipal governments takes far longer or proves far more complicated than the production's schedule can comfortably accommodate. The Konkan railway negotiations dragged on for long enough that the production ultimately had to abandon the idea altogether and look elsewhere for a setting that could deliver a comparable visual effect within the time frame available, illustrating how even a project with the resources and institutional relationships of a Bond film could not simply will a location into being available on demand. The overall arc of Skyfall's development and pre-production then tells a story of a project that had to survive a genuine existential threat to the studio behind it before it could even begin moving forward in earnest, followed by a compressed period in which casting, script revisions, and location scouting all had to proceed largely in parallel rather than in the more orderly, sequential fashion a production team might prefer. That compression placed considerable pressure on every department involved, from the writer still refining the script's structure, even as location scouts were already traveling to South Africa, to the producers negotiating a release date shuffle with Sony Pictures while casting announcements were still being finalized, that the production nonetheless assembled a stable, respected creative team, including a director, cinematographer, and production designer who had all worked together on previous non-Bond projects, gave the film a level of behind the scenes cohesion that would prove significant once shooting actually began, even after the central creative team had settled into place. The practical business of readying such a large scale production for filming took months of additional planning. Pre-production on this scale involves an enormous number of moving parts working simultaneously, scouting and securing dozens of locations across multiple countries, building elaborate practical sets, coordinating with local authorities and permitting bodies in several different jurisdictions, assembling a stunt and special effects team capable of executing sequences involving trains, motorcycles, explosions, and hand-to-hand combat, and negotiating a shooting schedule flexible enough to accommodate a production that would eventually span continents. For a franchise picture of Skyfall's scale and profile, this groundwork had to be laid carefully, since a miscalculated schedule or an unsecured location could threaten the fixed release date the studio and the Broccoli family had already committed to publicly. Filming principal photography had originally been scheduled to run for as long as 133 days, though the shoot ultimately wrapped after 128 days of filming. Cameras first rolled on the 7th November 2011 in London, with Dickens choosing to shoot the entire picture using Arri Alexa digital cameras rather than traditional film stock, a first for the Bond series, which up to that point had always been captured photochemically. London itself supplied an enormous number of locations across the shoot. Sequences were filmed inside stations of the London Underground, in the Smithfield car park in West Smithfield, at the National Gallery in Southwark along Whitehall and Parliament Square, at Charing Cross Station, at the Old Royal Naval College in Greenwich, in Cadogan Square, and around Tower Hill. St. Bartholomew's Hospital doubled as the setting for the scene in which Bond makes his way into MI6's new underground headquarters, while the disused tunnels beneath Waterloo Station, known as the Old Vic Tunnels, stood in for the MI6 training ground seen in the film. The scene depicting Q and Bond's first meeting in front of a painting was shot at the National Gallery after the museum had closed for the night, allowing the crew free rein over the empty galleries. Other London locations carried particular narrative weight. The offices of the Department of Energy and Climate Change were used for the rooftop scene set near the film's conclusion, when Bond stands looking out over the city. For the explosive destruction of MI6 headquarters at Vauxhall Cross, the production closed off Vauxhall Bridge and the surrounding Millbank area to traffic during filming. Notably, this was handled quite differently from how a similar MI6 explosion had been staged years earlier for The World Is Not Enough, which had used a large-scale physical replica of the building. For Skyfall, the explosion itself was instead created digitally during post-production, a reflection of how far visual effects technology and workflow had advanced across the intervening years. The film's climactic siege sequence, set at Bond's ancestral home, went through more than one location change before filming began. The production had initially planned to shoot the finale at Duntroon Castle in Argyll, but shortly after filming got underway elsewhere, the decision was made to relocate this portion of the shoot to Glencoe instead. Despite the story placing Skyfall Manor in the Scottish Highlands, the physical structure used to represent Bond's family home was actually built on Hankley Common in Surrey, constructed as a full-scale mock-up out of plywood and plaster rather than as a real standing building, a practical solution that allowed the production to control every aspect of the structure's eventual spectacular destruction. Production then shifted to Turkey in March 2012, continuing there until the 6th May. The city of Adana was used to stand in for the outskirts of Istanbul, providing the backdrop for much of the film's opening action sequence. During rehearsals for the elaborate rooftop and train top fight that opens the film, a group of Turkish teenagers managed to sneak onto the closed set at railway sidings in Adana before being caught and removed by security. The train top fight, glimpsed in the film's marketing trailers, was shot at the Varda Viaduct outside Adana, where stunt performer Andy Lister, doubling for Craig, executed a backward fall from a height of roughly 300 feet, secured by a safety line rigged from a crane mounted on one of the train carriages. Filming also made extensive use of central Istanbul itself, locations including the Spice Bazaar, the Yeni Cami Mosque, the Grand Post Office Building, Sultanahmet Square, and the Grand Bazaar were all closed to the public for filming during April. Shopkeepers whose stores were affected by the closures were reportedly permitted to keep their shops open for appearances, but were barred from actually conducting business and were instead compensated with a daily payment. The production also faced public criticism over allegations that a motorcycle chase filmed across the city's rooftops had damaged historic buildings. Producer Michael G. Wilson pushed back on those claims. explaining that the crew had removed sections of roofing ahead of filming and replaced them afterward with temporary reconstructions rather than damaging anything permanently. Separately, the production team negotiated directly with the 614 individual part owners of Collis Beach in Phet Yai in order to secure permission to film along that stretch of coastline. China also featured prominently in the finished film, with Mendes confirming early on that scenes would be set in Shanghai and other parts of the country. Screenwriter John Logan explained that the filmmakers deliberately sought out locations that would feel like the opposite of London, exotic settings meant to place Bond somewhere he would feel distinctly out of his element. In practice, however, none of the sequences involving the principal cast were actually filmed on location in Shanghai. Those scenes were shot entirely within the United Kingdom using a combination of substitute locations and studio work. A swimming pool at the Virgin Active Health Club in London's Canary Wharf financial district was dressed to serve as the pool at Bond's hotel. Ascot Racecourse stood in for Shanghai Pudong International Airport, and the Broadgate Tower office complex in London provided the entrance and lobby used for the exterior and interior of the Shanghai office building glimpsed in the film. The elaborate Golden Dragon casino set representing Macau was built from scratch on a soundstage at Pinewood Studios, decorated with roughly 300 floating lanterns and a pair of 30-foot tall illuminated dragon heads. To capture authentic aerial footage of the real Shanghai skyline for use in establishing shots, the production received permission to send a second unit up in a helicopter loaned by the Chinese government. The first official still image release from the production, made public on 1st February 2012, showed Craig on set at Pinewood standing within a built recreation of a Shanghai skyscraper interior. The design of Silver's abandoned island lair drew its inspiration from a real place, Hashima, a long deserted island off the coast of Nagasaki, Japan, once home to a thriving coal mining community and now known internationally as a haunting ghost town. Within the fiction of the film, the island is relocated and reimagined as lying just off the coast of Macau. Mendes explained that the sequence combining Bond and Severin's arrival at the island was achieved by blending large physical sets built to resemble decaying city streets with computer-generated establishing shots of the wider island. The idea to use Hashima as a reference point reportedly originated after Craig met Swedish filmmaker Thomas Nordenstad while shooting The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo in Stockholm, Nordenstad, who had made a short 2002 documentary about the island, recalled Craig taking detailed notes during their conversation, though he had no idea at the time that the actor's interest would eventually surface in a Bond film until Skyfall itself was released. Once photography had wrapped, the film was converted into the IMAX format for screenings in IMAX-equipped cinemas. Deakins had not been informed that the film would ultimately be released in IMAX until after he had already committed to shooting it on the Arri Alexa digital cameras, and his initial reaction to early IMAX test conversions of his footage was one of disappointment, feeling that the color reproduction did not look right on the larger format. After digging deeper into how the IMAX Corporation's proprietary remastering process worked, Deakins arranged for further tests to be made without that process applied and came away far more satisfied, finding that the footage looked genuinely spectacular projected on a true IMAX screen, a discovery that put his earlier reservations about the format to rest. Taken as a whole, the filming period demonstrates just how geographically expansive a modern Bond production had become by the early 2010s, moving across London, Surrey, Scotland, Turkey, and UK-based recreations of Shanghai and Macau, all within a roughly 6-month window of principal photography. Each leg of the shoot brought its own distinct logistical challenges, whether that meant negotiating with hundreds of individual property owners along a Turkish beach, working around the operating hours of a major national art museum in London, or constructing an entire fictional casino interior from scratch on a soundstage rather than filming on location at all. That the production was able to move through all of these very different environments within a single continuous shoot while still hitting the fixed release dates that had been locked in more than a year earlier, reflected the scale of planning and coordination that a tentpole studio franchise picture of this kind requires. Post production, much of the film's most technically demanding imagery, including the destruction of MI6's Vauxhall Cross headquarters, was assembled well after principal photography had concluded, relying on digital effects work rather than large-scale physical destruction of the kind used in some earlier Bond films. This approach gave the visual effects team considerably more control over how the sequence would ultimately look and allowed the production to avoid the logistical and financial burden of building and then destroying a massive physical set piece, a method the series had used decades earlier for a comparable sequence in The World Is Not Enough. Converting the finished film for IMAX exhibition formed another significant strand of post-production work. Because Skyfall had been shot digitally on ARRI Alexa cameras rather than on large format film, the conversion process required close collaboration between Deakins and the IMAX technical team to ensure that the finished digital images would hold up when blown up to fill IMAX screens. As noted above, Deakins was initially unconvinced by early tests but ultimately came away impressed. Once a version of the conversion was produced without the studio's standard proprietary remastering process applied. That resolution allowed the film to proceed as the first James Bond picture ever to be given a full IMAX release, a landmark moment for the franchise's relationship with large format cinema exhibition beyond the headline visual effects sequences. Post-production on a picture of this scope also involved the far less glamorous but equally essential work of color grading, sound design, and the layering in of the many digital background plates used to represent locations such as Shanghai that had not actually been filmed on location. Establishing shots of the Shanghai skyline captured by the second unit helicopter crew had to be seamlessly integrated with material filmed on sound stages and at substitute locations back in the United Kingdom, a process requiring close coordination between the visual effects supervisors, the editorial team, and Deakins himself to ensure that the lighting and color treatment of the digitally composited elements matched the photography captured on set. This kind of extensive post-production compositing work had become increasingly standard for large-scale action films by the early 2010s, allowing productions to suggest a truly global scope without necessarily requiring the cast and crew to travel to every single location depicted on screen. Editing duties on the picture were shared, with the finished cut shaped through the collaborative work of the editorial team assembled for the production, working closely with Mendes to balance the film's mixture of intimate character work and large-scale action set pieces. The finished running time came in at 143 minutes, making Skyfall one of the longer entries in the series. Up to that point, a length that would later factor into some of the critical commentary the film received upon release. Music Thomas Newman took on the role of composer for Skyfall's original score, stepping into a job that had been held for the previous several Bond films by David Arnold. Newman had a long standing working relationship with Mendes dating back to American Beauty and had also scored Road to Perdition, Jarhead, and Revolutionary Road for the director, making him a natural choice. Once Mendes was in a position to select his own collaborators for the picture with his hiring, Newman became the ninth different composer to contribute a score to the Bond franchise across its history. When asked publicly about the circumstances surrounding his own departure from the series, David Arnold indicated that Newman had been chosen because of his existing history with Mendes rather than the change being connected to Arnold's own commitment to working as composer for the opening ceremony of the 2012 Summer Olympics alongside director Danny Boyle. The full soundtrack album containing Newman's score was released on the 29 October 2012 in the United Kingdom, followed by a release in the United States on the 6th of November 2012. The film's theme song became one of the most talked about elements of the entire production. In October 2012, British singer-songwriter Adele confirmed publicly that she had written and recorded the film's title track together with her frequent songwriting collaborator Paul Epworth. She later shared an image of the sheet music for the song on Twitter, crediting the songwriting itself to herself and Epworth, while noting that both Epworth and orchestrator J.A.C. Redford had contributed to the arrangement. The song had its online release at 7 minutes past midnight British summertime on the 5 October 2012, a date the producers had deliberately dubbed James Bond Day, chosen because it marked exactly 50 years since Dr. No had first reached cinemas. The song went on to earn a string of major accolades. It received a nomination for and ultimately won the Academy Award for Best Original Song, making it the first Bond theme in the franchise's history to take home that particular Oscar, and only the fourth Bond song ever to be nominated in the category at all. Following in the footsteps of earlier nominees, For Your Eyes Only, Nobody Does It Better, and Live and Let Die. Beyond the Academy Awards, Skyfall also won the Brit Award for Best British Single at the 2013 Brit Awards, and it later picked up the Grammy Award for Best Song Written for Visual Media at the 2014 Grammy Awards, cementing its status as one of the most decorated pieces of music ever associated with the series beyond the score and the theme song. The finished film also weaves in a pair of older popular recordings at key emotional moments. Charles Trennett's 1938 song Bomb plays during the sequence in which Silva shows Bond around his abandoned island, lending an unsettling, incongruous jauntiness to the scene. Later, during the finale in which Silva launches his assault on the Skyfall estate, the film uses the Animals' 1964 cover of John Lee Hooker's blues standard Boom Boom, a musical choice that echoes the earlier use of Bomb through its similarly percussive, explosive sounding title while underscoring the violence of the sequence. Newman's score and Adele's theme song were developed on somewhat separate tracks during production, reflecting a fairly common arrangement on major franchise films where a title song is commissioned from an outside artist while the underscore is composed independently by the film's primary composer. Even so, elements of the two were woven together within the finished film and its accompanying soundtrack album, with the melodic motif of the title song reappearing at points within Newman's underscore, tying the film's emotional register to the song audiences would already associate with the picture from its extensive marketing rollout in the weeks before release. The choice to unveil the song publicly on the 5th October, deliberately built around the 50th anniversary date of Dr. No's original release, reflected the broader marketing strategy behind Skyfall as a whole, one that consistently sought to connect the new film back to the franchise's history at almost every promotional opportunity available. That strategy extended to the song's eventual awards success as well, with its Academy Award, Brit Award, and Grammy Award wins, each generating fresh rounds of press coverage that kept the film's 50th anniversary framing in the public conversation well beyond its initial theatrical release window. Release theatrical Skyfall had its world premiere on the 23 October 2012 at the Royal Albert Hall in London, a grand and historic venue befitting the scale of the franchise's 50th anniversary celebrations. The event drew notable attendees from British public life, including Charles, Prince of Wales, and his wife Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall. Prince Charles requested that proceeds raised through the premiere be directed toward charities supporting former and serving members of Britain's intelligence services, tying the glamour of the event to a cause with direct relevance to the film's subject matter. Following the London premiere, the film opened generally in the United Kingdom 3 days later on the 26th October and then made its way into American cinemas on the 8th November. Skyfall carried particular significance for large format film presentation, becoming the very first James Bond picture to be shown in IMAX venues, and in North America, the studio chose to release it into IMAX auditoriums a full day ahead of its conventional wide release, giving IMAX audiences an early opportunity to see the film before the broader theatrical rollout began. The film did not entirely escape controversy in the run-up to its release. The US-based Sexual Violence Resource Center raised concerns about the film, criticizing a scene in which Bond appears to initiate a sexual encounter with Severine, a character established within the story as a former victim of sex trafficking. The organization's objection was notable in part because it was issued without the group having actually screened the finished film themselves, basing its concern instead on second-hand descriptions of the scene's content and its implications about the dynamics of power and consent between the two characters. The theatrical rollout was accompanied by a substantial international press and promotional effort in the weeks leading up to release, consistent with the scale of a franchise entry positioned as the centerpiece of an entire year of 50th anniversary programming. Press conferences, cast interviews, and the staggered release of official images and footage all fed into a promotional campaign designed to build anticipation steadily over many months, beginning with the November 2011 cast announcement and continuing through the release of the theme song in October 2012 and on into the string of premieres held in different territories around the world. This extended promotional runway meant that by the time the film actually opened, audience anticipation had already been building for the better part of a year, a dynamic that likely contributed to the unusually strong opening weekend results. The film went on to post in multiple territories simultaneously. Commercially, the theatrical release proved to be an enormous success practically from its opening day. Skyfall ultimately grossed $1.109 billion worldwide over the course of its theatrical run, a figure that made it at the time the highest grossing film worldwide that year for its distributor, Sony Pictures, and the second highest grossing film released globally in 2012 overall. momentum was evident right from the start. On its opening weekend, the film earned $80.6 million across 25 international markets. In the United Kingdom specifically, the film opened to £20.1 million over its first Friday to Sunday weekend, a result that made it the second highest opening weekend in British box office history at that point, trailing only Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. It also posted the second highest IMAX opening weekend ever recorded up to that time, behind only The Dark Knight Rises. The film's momentum in the UK continued to build in the weeks that followed. It set a new record for the highest 7-day gross in British box office history, taking in £37. 2 million over its first week, comfortably surpassing the previous record of £35.7 million set by Deathly Hallows Part 2. By the 9th of November 2012, Skyfall's UK earnings had climbed past £57 million, enough to overtake The Dark Knight Rises as the highest grossing film of 2012 in the country, and to become, at that point, the highest grossing James Bond film of all time within the United Kingdom. After 40 days on release, the film's cumulative UK gross reached £94.28 million now, edging past the £94.03 million that Avatar had previously earned to become the highest grossing film ever released in the United Kingdom up to that point. By 30th December 2012, the UK total had climbed beyond 100 million NOS, equivalent to roughly 161.6 million NOS, making Skyfall the first film ever to cross that particular UK milestone. That same day also saw the film pass $1 billion in worldwide box office receipts, making it only the 14th film in cinema history and the very first James Bond film to reach that threshold. The achievement also pushed Skyfall past the inflation-adjusted total of $1.47 billion previously attributed to Thunderball, making Skyfall at the time the seventh highest grossing film ever made when its total earnings were measured against those of other films across cinema history. Beyond the United Kingdom, individual territories around the world reported similarly striking results. Switzerland recorded its biggest opening weekend on record for the film, taking in $5.3 million, while India logged the second largest opening weekend of the year there for any Hollywood release with $5.1 million. France, meanwhile, saw the film earn $14.3 million over its opening weekend. Austria recorded its second highest opening weekend ever for the film at $3.4 million, trailing only The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, while Finland reported its largest opening weekend on record once preview screenings were excluded from the total at $1.47 million. In North America, the film opened across 3,505 cinemas, the widest theatrical release any Bond film had received up to that point. Midnight screenings alone brought in $2.4 million on opening day, with a further $2 million coming specifically from IMAX and other large format screens. Across its full opening day in the United States and Canada, Skyfall earned $30.8 million and it went on to take in $88. $4 million over its complete opening weekend in the region, the biggest weekend debut the Bond franchise had ever recorded at that point. By the time its theatrical run had run its course, the film had earned $304.4 million across the United States and Canada, ranking it as the fourth highest grossing film released in that region during 2012. Home media Skyfall made its way onto home entertainment formats a few months after its theatrical run concluded. In the United States and Canada, the film was released on DVD, Blu-ray, and digital HD on 12 February 2013, followed shortly afterward by a UK home media release on 18th of February 2013, handled jointly by 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment and MGM Home Entertainment. Years later, the film received a further home media upgrade when it was released on Ultra HD Blu-ray on the 22 October 2019, packaged together with the other three Daniel Craig-led Bond films of that era as part of a collected box set. An individual standalone Ultra HD Blu-ray edition of Skyfall followed several months later on a 25 February 2020. The staggered rollout of these home media editions from the initial 2013 DVD and Blu-ray release through to the Ultra HD Blu-ray upgrades released years later reflects the way major studio catalog titles are typically revisited and reissued as home entertainment formats themselves continue to evolve. The decision to bundle Skyfall together with the other Daniel Craig era Bond films for the 2019 Ultra HD box set framed the picture as part of a coherent ongoing storyline running from Casino Royale through to the characters' later adventures, reinforcing the way Skyfall had been positioned from the outset, both narratively and commercially, as a pivotal middle chapter within Craig's tenure as Bond, rather than as a fully self-contained standalone entry. Reception box office Skyfall's box office performance placed it among the most commercially successful films ever released, and its financial results were closely tracked and reported throughout its run precisely because they kept setting new benchmarks, both for the Bond franchise specifically and for the broader film industry. As detailed above, the film's worldwide total of $109 billion made it the 14th film in history to cross the billion-dollar threshold and the very first Bond picture to do so, a milestone that carried considerable symbolic weight for a franchise then celebrating its 50th anniversary. At the time of its release, that total also made Skyfall the seventh highest grossing film ever produced, surpassing the long-standing inflation-adjusted total previously credited to the 1965 Bond film Thunderball, and it stood as the second highest grossing film released anywhere in the world during 2012, trailing only The Avengers. Within the United Kingdom specifically, the film's performance was nothing short of record-breaking. It became the first film in British box office history to surpass £100 million, domestically a figure equivalent to roughly $161. 6 million, and along the way it broke records for the biggest opening weekend behind only the final Harry Potter installment, the fastest 7-day gross in UK history, and the title of the single highest grossing film ever released in the United Kingdom up to that point, ahead of Avatar. It also stood at the time as the highest grossing James Bond film ever released in its home market, reflecting both the strength of general audience interest and a wave of nostalgic goodwill tied to the franchise's anniversary year in North America. Skyfall's opening was the widest theatrical release any Bond film had ever received, playing in 3,505 cinemas simultaneously, and it's $88. 4 million opening weekend represented the biggest debut the franchise had ever posted in the region up to that point, its eventual North American total of $304. 4 million made it the fourth highest grossing film released in the United States and Canada during 2012. An especially strong showing for a franchise entry, given that Bond films have historically tended to perform somewhat more modestly in North America relative to their results overseas. Individual international markets also delivered standout results, including record opening weekends in Switzerland and Finland, and the second biggest Hollywood opening of the year in India, underlining just how broadly the film's commercial success was distributed across different territories around the world, rather than being concentrated in any single region. The scale of this commercial performance also carried significance beyond Skyfall itself. At a moment when the long term viability of the Bond franchise had genuinely been in question just a couple of years earlier because of MGM's financial collapse. $1 billion worldwide result arriving in the very year the series was marking its 50th anniversary effectively answered any lingering doubts about whether audiences still had an appetite for the character following the uncertainty of the preceding few years. The film's box office trajectory, opening strongly and then continuing to build rather than dropping off sharply in subsequent weeks, was itself read by industry commentators at the time as evidence of unusually positive word of mouth feeding back into ticket sales, a pattern consistent with the strongly positive critical notices and the A grade the film received from CinemaScore audience polling. That combination of critical acclaim, awards recognition, and sustained box office momentum across dozens of individual markets made Skyfall's commercial run one of the more thoroughly analyzed and frequently cited case studies of a franchise film, successfully renewing itself for a new generation of audiences while still drawing on decades of built-in brand recognition. Critical response. Skyfall was greeted by critics with what the outlet Global Post summarized at the time as generally positive reviews from both critics and fans alike, and the film's overall critical standing has remained strong in the years since its release. On the review aggregation website Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating of 92% based on 388 collected reviews with an average score of 820 out of 10. The site's consensus assessment credits Sam Mendes with bringing Bond roaring back through a smart, sexy, and gripping action thriller that ranks among the finest entries the 007 series has ever produced. On Metacritic, which aggregates and weights reviews on a 100-point scale, the film holds a score of 81 based on 49 critics, a strong result reflecting broad critical consensus rather than a more polarized reception. Audience response tracked similarly well. Polling conducted by CinemaScore found that the average grade filmgoers assigned the film was an A on the service's A+ to F scale, indicating that the positive critical reaction was matched by strong word of mouth among general audiences as well. A recurring theme among reviewers was the question of whether Skyfall represented not just a strong Bond film, but potentially the best entry the franchise had ever produced. That question was raised explicitly by a number of prominent critics, including Kate Meyer, writing for The Times, Philip French in The Observer, Daniel Krupa of IGN, and reviewers at both the Irish Independent and the Daily Record. Robbie Collin, reviewing the film for the Daily Telegraph, judged it to be frequently dazzling and consistently bold, praising its action sequences while noting that the film also managed to balance humor and genuine emotional weight. Todd McCarthy, writing for The Hollywood Reporter, found the film dramatically gripping while still carrying an understated current of dry humor running beneath the surface, adding that it possessed real substance and complexity as a piece of storytelling. Variety's Peter DeBruge argued that the film's greatest strength lay in its willingness to give equal weight to character development and to its large-scale action set pieces, allowing the two elements to coexist and reinforce one another rather than compete for the audience's attention. Manohla Dargis, reviewing the film for the New York Times, considered it a superior follow-up to Casino Royale, describing its tone as lavish rather than over the top, and consistently understated in its approach. Kim Newman, writing for Empire magazine, concluded that the film delivered essentially everything one could want from a 21st century Bond picture, cool without tipping into respectful of the series' long tradition, while still feeling thoroughly contemporary, seriously thrilling yet meaningfully complex in its characterization, all without losing the sense of fun that had sometimes felt absent from more recent installments. Roger Ebert, reviewing for the Chicago Sun-Times, awarded the film a full 4 out of 4 stars, describing it as a joyous, intelligent, and full blooded celebration of a beloved cultural icon. Ryan Gilbey, writing for the New Statesman, observed that a strong current of nostalgia ran through the picture and suggested that in this instance the old approach still proved to be the best one. Daniel Craig's performance in the lead role drew particular praise from multiple critics. Roger Ebert felt that in Skyfall, Craig had fully claimed ownership of a role he had played well in Casino Royale and somewhat less convincingly in Quantum of Solace. Philip French remarked that Craig had finally managed to step out from under the shadow cast by Sean Connery's original portrayal of the character, while Daniel Cooper described Craig's performance as a defining turn for what he called a genuinely great actor. Edward Porter, writing for the Sunday Times, felt that Craig had developed a version of Bond marked by authority, dryness, and intelligence, and Ryan Gilbey similarly observed that Craig had settled comfortably into the role without sacrificing any of the character's underlying steeliness. The film's supporting performances also received substantial critical attention. Roger Ebert felt the film finally gave Judi Dench, whom he considered one of the finest actors of her generation, a role that was truly worthy of her talents, noting that she functioned almost as a co-lead given her extensive screen time, the poignancy of her dialogue, and a level of complexity and sympathy in her characterization that exceeded what audiences typically expect from the series. Jenny McCartney, writing for the Sunday Telegraph, agreed with that assessment, describing Dench as compellingly luminous on screen and suggesting she was the character the camera lingered on most meaningfully and most often throughout the film. McCartney also praised Javier Bardem's turn as Silva, noting the character was played with a distinctly unsettling flair, while critic Henry K. Miller went further still, describing Silva as the most convincingly Bond-appropriate villain the series had produced in decades. Several critics singled out the film's deeper supporting bench as well. Kim Newman highlighted the warmth and gravitas Albert Finney brought to his performance, while other reviewers, including Edward Porter, Daniel Krupa, and the playlist Oliver Littleton, praised Ralph Fiennes' turn as Mallory and Ben Whishaw's performance as the rebooted younger Q behind the camera. Sam Mendes' direction was widely credited with revitalizing the franchise. And Hornaday, writing for the Washington Post, felt Mendes had reinvigorated the series, describing the finished film as sleek, crisp, and praising the way it balanced a respect for the franchise's legacy with a genuine embrace of new ideas. Henry K. Miller of Sight and Sound expressed similar admiration for Mendes' work, going so far as to suggest the director deserved the opportunity to direct further entries in the series. Kim Newman also singled out Mendes' handling of the film's action sequences for praise. The contribution of cinematographer Roger Deakins drew particularly strong notices as well. Newman remarked that Deakins had delivered the most visually impressive work the series had produced since the 1960s, while Henry K. Miller described the finished film as dazzlingly photographed. a sentiment echoed across a great deal of the critical commentary surrounding the film's visual style. Not every aspect of the film escaped criticism, however. A number of reviewers pointed to its 2.5 hour running time and felt that the film's concluding third dragged in comparison to the tighter momentum of its first two acts, identifying pacing in the closing stretch as one of the picture's clearer weaknesses. Zan Brooks of The Guardian, writing an otherwise largely favorable review, took issue with what he described as an overly indulgent decision to dwell on Bond's backstory and to spend so much time exploring his relationship with M, finding that choice somewhat self-satisfied in its execution. Daniel Krupa was also critical of Naomie Harris's performance, specifically describing her work in the film as awkward and finding what he felt was a near total absence of on-screen chemistry between her and Craig. Philip French, writing in The Observer, tempered his overall praise for the film by pointing to what he called some lazy repetition within the plotting, arguing that the film's dialogue occasionally felt perfunctory and that, in keeping with a familiar franchise pattern, Bond ends up being captured a little too easily and then escapes captivity a little too easily as well. Edward Porter, writing for the Sunday Times, likewise felt that certain elements of the film were handled with real wit and style, but found the climax somewhat underwhelming by comparison, though he added that the weaknesses evident in the film's final stretch were relatively minor and that its brief closing epilogue worked extremely well. Skyfall's critical and cultural standing has also proven durable well beyond its initial release window. In 2025, The Hollywood Reporter looked back across the films of that year and named Skyfall as having featured the best stunt work of 2012, a reflection of how the film's technical and physical achievements have continued to be recognized long after its initial theatrical run concluded. The film's awards record further underscores how well it was received at the time. At the 85th Academy Awards, Skyfall picked up nominations for Best Cinematography, Best Original Score, and Best Sound Mixing, and it won 2 Oscars outright. For Best Original Song, the first time any Bond theme song had ever won that award, and for Best Sound Editing. Beyond the Academy Awards, the film collected 8 nominations at the British Academy Film Awards, of which it won 2, 7 nominations at the Critics' Choice Movie Awards, of which it won 3, and a nomination at the Golden Globe Awards, which it also won. Taken together, this pattern of critical reaction painted a picture of a film that was seen as accomplishing something genuinely difficult, reinvigorating a 50-year-old franchise while still honoring the conventions and pleasures that had made it endure in the first place. Where earlier reviews of Bond films in the Craig era had sometimes divided critics over how far the series should lean into gritty realism versus the more theatrical, larger-than-life tone of its classic period, the reception of Skyfall suggested that critics broadly felt Mendes and his collaborators had found a workable balance between those two impulses. The praise directed at Dench's performance in particular reflected a broader critical appreciation for the way the film used its 50th anniversary positioning to look backward at the character's history and forward at its future simultaneously, folding meditations on age, obsolescence, and institutional loyalty into what remained at its core a large commercial action picture. The film's ability to satisfy both those who wanted spectacle and those who wanted psychological depth was repeatedly cited by critics as the key to its unusually broad and enthusiastic reception, both among reviewers and as reflected in its cinema score results among general movie-going audiences as well.